Hello, everyone. Welcome to Simulation. It's good to see all you beautiful people tonight. Thanks for coming out. How many of you guys have been to a Simulation event before? Round of applause, maybe, for those who have been. All right. Those who have not yet? Okay, all right, good. Okay, cool. So Simulation is a daily show and live event series that features some of the greatest scientists, entrepreneurs, and educators of our time. We aim to fill football stadiums with thinkers and doers and intellectuals. We're going to and see if 22 guys in football pads can do it. Why can't the curious intellectuals do it, right? All right, let's get it. Let's do it. Let's get that goal. All right. I would love to just be like, our next guest needs. So eventually, Jason Silva is an amazing man. Super grateful to have him join us today. He's a host of Brain Games. He is the host of Shots of Awe. You guys love his videos, yeah? Filmmaker, storyteller, the man of the hour. Let's bring out Jason Silva.
Hey, guys. Thank you. Wow. What's up, guys? Thank you for coming out. Appreciate having you guys here. And thank you, Alan, for organizing this. I'm thrilled to be here with you.
It's such a blessing to have this opportunity to share conversation with you in front of this amazing audience of beautiful people.
Dude, I'm honored. I know you had Jordan Peterson and Michael Pollan recently, so I was just excited to try to follow in the footsteps of those giants for your series. So thanks for having me.
I think that you do. You follow really well in those footsteps. And okay, life is all about you and not at all about you. We have this question that's come up. You made this amazing video called Existential Bummer.
Yeah.
Yes.
Have you guys seen that video? Yeah. Existential Bummer. You know, it's funny. When I first started doing Shots of Awe, most of the videos that I used to make were about technology and futurism. I had read Ray Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near, When Humans Transcend Biology, and the sci-fi geek in me just got basically an intellectual hard-on. And what I mean by that was that here was this grand narrative whereby we would use our creativity and our technology to overcome our limitations and become as gods, right? And that's what all of my videos in the beginning were about. And this made me very popular in the TED conference circles, and people that were into innovation and technology and transhumanism started to eat up my content, which was beautiful. Eventually, I partnered with Discovery Digital Networks, which came to me and said, we want to give you the resources to extend these videos you're doing to explore all different kinds of topics. And from there came the opportunity to, I guess, explore different topics. And I think it was our first or our second shoot. We were in Amsterdam, and I did a video called Existential Bummer, which I think fundamentally is, to be honest, the worm at the core, the faint disquiet that haunts our dreams. And Existential Bummer was inspired by the work of Ernest Becker. Ernest Becker wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book called The Denial of Death in 1974. And this book was a distillation of the human condition as he saw it. He was a psychologist. And it kind of built on the Freudian idea that our neurosis and our anxiety stems from us being like sexually repressed. And Ernest Becker's idea was that no, our anxiety and our existential conundrum is not only that we're sexually repressed, but it's that we're repressing the most fundamental horror of all, which is that we are mortal beings. Mortal beings who dream of immortality. I remember this professor called Sheldon Solomon, who was featured in a documentary called Flight from Death, that put it quite succinctly. He said, the explicit awareness that you're a breathing piece of defecating meat, destined to die and ultimately no more significant than a lizard or a potato, is not especially uplifting. This was the worm at the core. It's like, no matter what our aspirations, no matter what our dreams, no matter how intense our love affairs, how high is our ecstasies, like everything was sort of tinged by this anxiety about ephemerality, about transience. And so Existential Bummer was an exploration of that tension, of that disjointment, right? It was like, well, here are these cosmic beings that can dream about the infinite, right? That can ponder the infinite, yet we're housed in heart-pumping, breath-gasping, decaying bodies. I mean, it's like, holy shit, that's where Existential Bummer came from for me. And it's a very personal video, and I think it resonated with a lot of people because I think it maybe it gave voice to something that we all have felt but hadn't quite articulated. It's like when it's, you turn 20 years old or 25 years old, it's your birthday, you're supposed to be celebrating, but you start to get like this kind of sadness about the fact that it's another birthday and another trip around the sun and, or that feeling you get when you stare at old photographs, right? Those sepia-toned photographs, the aging photographs. It's what makes filters on Instagram so poignant. To make something vintage, to age it, increases its poignancy because it reminds you that the moment is past, that it was a transitory enchanted moment that is no more. And this, like, for me, it's just like it's a gnawing anxiety. And I think that whether we're aware of it or not, I think it's the worm at the core for a lot of our mental distress. And I think Existential Bummer gave voice to that.
Yeah. So. And there's
sorry, I go off on these tirades.
You do so well at it. You speak with such passion and articulation that you observe the world and then you form it so beautifully and eloquently.
Thanks, bro.
And
we
all think that way, about you. So, okay, so you see this impermanence, but you also want to be creative and leave behind something that is very impactful. Mm-hmm. Is that Shots of Awe?
Yeah, very much so. So when I discovered the Ernest Becker book, it kind of gave voice to the sensation I was feeling. And a little pop culture reference about that book, Woody Allen in the movie Annie Hall. It's a book that he buys for her in the bookstore, The Denial of Death, and he's like, this is the book that will explain why I'm so neurotic and terrified that the universe is meaningless and so on and so forth. I believe in that same documentary that I mentioned where Sheldon Solomon speaks, the opening line is this idea that we have emerged from nothing. We have a name. We have consciousness of self. We have deep inner feeling. We have this excruciating inner yearning for life and self-expression. And yet with all this, yet to die, right? Human beings are in quite the predicament. We have the mental capacity to ponder the infinite, yet we're housed in heart-pumping, breath-gasping, decaying bodies. So we're gods and worms. Mm-hmm. And so essentially, he establishes the human condition, and then he maps the ways in which we have dealt with the fire in the belly. And there's 3 historical ways that we have placated death and put it out of our minds. The first one, of course, is religion. Right?
But love could have happened before religion, right? So
religion was the first antidote to the mortal coil. If you served God, you would go to heaven. You would experience salvation. You follow these rules, and you will live forever in the kingdom of God. I mean, it works, And the problem, of course, is that religion then gets corrupted by humans, and we use religion to justify horrific acts against one another, and it's my religion against your religion, and these are like immortality projects, and we fight to the death for our immortality projects. And of course, with the scientific revolution and increasingly secular outlooks, religion might be a pleasant ritual, and certainly Gothic cathedrals and temples and synagogues can be beautiful architectural masterpieces that are homages to the transcendent, but for those of us that don't or aren't convinced that following the scripture will make us live forever, we need something else to absolve us of our terror. And so the second way in which we placate mortality is with the romantic solution to the problem of death. And the romantic solution to the problem of death, of course, you guys are well familiar with. I mean, that's like Western civilization and Shakespeare. She's like the wind, she's my salvation, she is the sun. It's Romeo and Juliet. It's the deification of the other. It's to find somebody that you can worship, that you can elevate to godhood, and that by rubbing up against this sacred being, you will yourself be saved as well. And that gets reinforced by the movies and by the pop songs and by the poetry. And it's beautiful to turn a human being into a god or a goddess. I mean, in many ways, we are gods and goddesses. We just happen to be gods and goddesses that die. But we are gods and goddesses nonetheless. And so I think that again, the romantic solution to the problem of death solves that problem temporarily, because it's like that Jewish mystic Martin Buber talks about I-thou relationships. Yeah. It's like when you truly encounter another being, right? You truly see another person as a cosmic being, and you elevate them to this position of godhood, you temporarily enter an altered state of consciousness in which time doesn't exist. I mean, to be in love is to be outside of time.
And we can even achieve that with someone we don't know by just looking at their eyes and staying silent for 15, 30 seconds.
Potentially, yes. We glimpse the infinite in the eyes of another, no doubt. And a guy called Alan Harrington, in his book The Immortalist, says that during these moments, if you think of life as like this people mover, like those airport people movers, and that we're all patiently doing our thing and living our dramas, but the people mover keeps going like towards the ravine that is the end, that is the death, that is the negation of all there is. He says that when we're in love, the altered state of consciousness that is occasioned by romantic rapture and rhapsody takes us out of the people mover. Mm-hmm. So now we get to commingle with one another as gods outside of time. Mm-hmm. Now, I imagine anybody who's ever been in love, anybody who's ever lost themselves in a beautiful song, knows this feeling very well. We are absolved from ourselves in the rhapsody of love. The problem is it's a transitory experience. It occurs outside of time, but it's still bounded by time on both ends. I know that sounds like a contradiction, but that's what seems to happen. It's like, well, I was outside of time for 3 months with this person, and now... Yeah, that's what it's like. And then what happens, he says, is that no relationship can bear the burden of godhood, because the pressure of wanting to be saved by a finite being puts a lot of pressure. Our gods and goddesses eventually reveal their clay feet, right? And that is such a moment of despair and or disappointment. And it's fucked up because it comes with all kinds of guilt as well. Like, how could you be disappointed in the one that you love because they couldn't be who you needed them to be? It's like that Radiohead lyric that says, I wish I could be who you wanted, because it's a lot of pressure.
And the honeymoon phase ends.
The honeymoon phase ends, and biochemically we can't sustain these states as long as we want them to. And so finally he says that the third solution to the problem of death is the creative solution. And the creative solution to the problem of death might be called the human enterprise. It's what we do with that anxiety. It's how we direct that anxiety towards overcoming limitations, overcoming obstacles, transcending ourselves, building marvelous jetliners and cathedrals and wireless communication technologies, and making transcendent art, and making films, and creating virtual reality experiences, and concocting places like Burning Man where we can actualize the human imagination. I mean, the creative solution to the problem of death in many ways is the transcendence of the problem of death. Because by many accounts, we have become a geological force in nature, right? Like, if you look at the topography of any modern city, this is something David Deutsch talks about in the beginning of Infinity. If you look at the topography of any modern city like Manhattan or San Francisco, that physical topography is a topography that is shaped more by mind and economics and intentionality and culture than by geology. So the creative solution to the problem of death is that our mind and our collective efforts have now trumped geology as a force in nature. So that's like our transcendence of mortality in a way. It's still symbolic ultimately because everybody still dies, but maybe not for long. There's a lot of billionaires in Silicon Valley working right now to overcome death by reprogramming our genetics, which, by the way, will be the most exciting thing ever once it spreads to all of us. Because at first, right, it'll only be accessible by a few, people say. But regardless...
shout out to Aubrey de Grey.
Aubrey de Grey, you're doing an event with him tomorrow, yeah. But ultimately, Becker says that probably the creative solution to the problem of death, even if it's purely symbolic, even if it's purely metaphorical, even if it's just that you wrote an amazing poem and that you kind of hurled yourself into the abyss and realized that it's a featherbed, to quote McKenna. Like, there's that can be like the noble act, the creative act that allows you to sort of transcend your death symbolically. And he says it's probably the healthiest response to our conundrum, to live a life full of meaning and full of purpose seems to be the greatest antidote against this despair that currently exists.
And then is that distributed evenly amongst people? The ability to be creative. It seems like so many are trapped in the economic and political machine.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, if you're hungry, you can't be too concerned about meaning. If you've got to pay the bills, you got to pay the bills. But that goes back to the whole Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. I mean, all these questions of cosmological significance are a luxury at the end of the day, because it assumes that you were able to feed yourself for breakfast and that you're not dying of some horrific physical ailment. I mean, certainly, I think in some ways, that's why certain parts of the world, maybe that are less wealthy, actually report higher incidences of life satisfaction in some bizarre way. And it's because, like you're busy doing your thing, you're going to work, and you don't have time to ask these profound questions. So certainly...
don't have the toxicity of some of the other things.
Yeah, but the point is, I think these questions are only going to become more relevant because technological advances and development across the world continues to pull hundreds of millions of people out of poverty all the time. There's this emerging global middle class that is becoming more aspirational and thus is more concerned with meaning, or increasingly will be, and eventually they're going to hit the rock of the privilege, which is what happens when you get everything you want. What happens when you get all the money? What happens when you get the one you loved? And then you realize that's it. The game is over. Actually, Jordan Peterson talks about that really brilliantly. He talks about the importance of the noble aim, and this is something that really resonated with me. He says the noble aim is something that you want to move towards and you want to organize your life around, but you never actually want to attain it. Because if you attain it, the game is over. That's the problem. You want to be moving towards it and always have it just beyond your grasp so that it orients you and it gives you a map of meaning and it gives you a sort of purpose and an orientation, and a compass, so to speak. But, life is not in getting what you want. Life is about fighting for meaning. And it's a lesson that we seem to be learning over and over and over again. When you got that toy in the toy store, when you graduated from middle school, when you got that degree, when you got the job, when you got the car, it doesn't satiate us,
And these are short-term goals, and then we get to the next goal. Maybe whatever the long-term goal ends up being, it is to continuously be creative in the world. So maybe things like automation and AI, whatever ends up happening in the future, will enable more people to be creative over time.
Well, the problem of meaning is not going away, right? I think I've read some reports that really developed societies like in Scandinavia and all these places where socioeconomic anxiety is minimal and it's a very egalitarian society and people have most of what they want. They have all these social cushions, but nonetheless the problem of suicide and all this kind of stuff is really fucked up. And I think that the problem of meaning is going to be more and more a problem even as we become wealthier as a society potentially. And the guy Yuval Harari, who wrote *Sapiens* and *Homo Deus*.
Literally the best book.
He says he wrote an article about finding meaning in life in an age without work. Because his prediction is that our worst fears about technological automation robbing us of our jobs, but also of our life purpose and meaning, is a very real thing. And now, on the optimistic front, yes, increasing advances, exponential advances in technology and artificial intelligence and all these things will eventually create a world where people don't have to work, where the AIs will be able to take care of most of what everybody needs. But it's going to leave all this empty space in people's lives. And so what are we going to do to fill that space, And he says that we're actually going to probably fill that space in video games, virtual reality.
Virtual realities.
Yeah, but here's the thing. He says that we already give meaning to our lives with virtual realities, such as culture, identity, religion, your name. I mean, these are not biological truths. These are cultural, virtual realities, and nonetheless we use them to fill our lives with meaning and purpose, supposedly. So he predicts that in the future, virtual reality systems will be fully immersive, indistinguishable from the real, and we will be able to lose ourselves in those worlds and undergo the kind of mythological heroes' journeys that Joseph Campbell vividly writes about, or that our favorite films beautifully map out. I mean, wouldn't you want to be Neo in The Matrix and fucking rock it out forever? Like, I mean, I think that...
You're in an 80-year one right now.
I'm in a what?
You're in an 80-year virtual reality experiment right now.
Potentially, if this is all a simulation, as your event postulates.
But then you get to design your own virtual worlds, and you get to tweak and play with the different variables and enter them. And
look, there's no doubt. I think that the tragedy of the human situation is that we are these exquisite, sensitive, thoughtful artists and poets, who have the capacity to imagine so much and to dream so much, and either A, we don't have the opportunity to express that beauty, that ecstasy, that yearning because of economic reasons, but also because of physiological reasons. Maybe you had to work most of your life and then you got an illness, when you were 25,
You studied philosophy, and that really puts you into a point of where you were at when you were in your 20s, and other people don't study philosophy and they're working lots of jobs, and so that also makes potentially less creative beings.
Yes, I mean, I studied philosophy because I was lucky. I had a mother who was an artist who kind of encouraged me to do what I loved. But I'm aware that that's a privilege, for sure. Yeah.
The more that we can mold these minds into the world to understand what you're teaching right now about the existential bummer, I think more people will seek that creative unleashing into the world.
I hope so.
Okay, so we have this problem.
Yeah, the human condition is problematic. Yes. we live in an age of incredible abundance, incredible opportunity, but also increasingly high levels of despair. The burden and the gift of consciousness is a double-edged sword. Yeah, right. It gives us this immense capacity to create and to express ourselves and to do everything we've done. Look how far we've come. Look how fast we've gotten here. At the same time, it makes us uniquely aware that we are finite and we are limited. And I believe that the crisis of our age is a crisis of meaning, and I think that is the source of the high rates of despair and anxiety and depression and the high levels of medication. And we need an antidote to the human conundrum, I would say, and that looking for that antidote is what fuels my videos. That's why I do what I do. My videos are like sort of these verbal explorations of me trying to work through, my own, to sort of my preoccupation with making sense of things and finding a way forward. So that's the inspiration behind my work. Existential bummer, I guess, is the genesis of everything else. Everything else is in response to the existential bummer.
And it's an amazing way to unleash that creative potential through. So we say this is a crisis of meaning. It's a problem, and you're providing an antidote through shots of awe. What other antidotes do we have? How else can we explain this problem to make it more relatable to people about how to find the antidotes?
Yeah, so, well, one of the ways that I think we can, the diseases of depression and anxiety are both characterized by excessive rumination, right? Our inability to get out of our heads. Again, the burden of self-consciousness is that we're thinkers, but when thinking can also become oppressive, because in the face of death, we can be paralyzed to act, like to be fully naked and trembling before the cosmos is a scary thing. And so it can send us into these loops of despair, this excessive rumination and self-consciousness, which characterizes anxiety and depression. Anxiety is too much possibility, and I'm terrified, and I'm being torn apart, by fear. And depression is the walls are caving in, and I'm stuck in this small reality, and I can't transcend it, and so on and so forth. But both of them are characterized by excessive rumination and self-consciousness. And so one of the ways out is to get out of our heads. And this is where, for me, I discovered the power of flow states. So, for those of you who are not familiar with flow, there's a book written by a guy called Csikszentmihalyi called Beyond Boredom and Anxiety. And most of us oscillate, for the most part, between these two states of mind, boredom and or anxiety. And beyond these two, though, is a state of consciousness that many of us are familiar with, even though it tends to be fleeting and finite, but it's a state of consciousness that typically fills us with incredible joy and rhapsody, and this is a state of flow, also known as the runner's high, also known as, being in the pocket, if you're a jazz musician, being in the zone, if you're an athlete. And Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheel, who are the founders of the Flow Genome Project, they describe flow as a state of consciousness in which you feel your best and you perform your best, right? So think about that, right? It's a state of mind in which you feel your very best, so you're blissed out, but also your levels of performance and whatever the task at hand is that triggered flow go through the roof. So if you're a writer, that's like when you completely lose yourself and 5 hours feels like 2 minutes, and you wrote the best thing you've ever written in your life, and you feel amazing, and you're energized, and you're pumped, and it's like, give me some more of that. If you are a musician, it's when you go on some improvisational solo, and you had an out-of-body experience. You were like in the audience watching yourself, and you couldn't believe what you were doing. I certainly feel flow sometimes when I do my videos, in that it just totally feels like, the word ecstasis means to be beside yourself, to be outside yourself, so it really does feel like you've moved out of your own way. It reminds me of the movie Black Swan. You guys seen that movie, Black Swan? Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful line where the choreographer is telling her, the only thing standing in your way is you.
Yeah.
That's a metaphor, right? But it's a metaphor saying the only thing standing in your way is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is the inner critic, the inner Woody Allen that's constantly self-doubting everything and saying, it's all for nothing because we're all going to grow old and die one day. Or, it's all for nothing, you'll never make it. Or, it's all for nothing because you're not good enough. You quiet that, and then something else emerges. A more curious you, a more open you, a more present you, right? And people experience that as relief. They experience that as liberation, and it turns out that when you're in these states, pattern recognition goes up, lateral thinking goes up, risk-taking goes up. So you find yourself doing things in spite of yourself, and that's where all the good shit happens, right? Everything great begins at the edge of our comfort zone. Everything you want is on the other side of fear. These bumper stickers are there for a reason. And so, I came across, I had my own experiences of tapping into flow. It started probably in high school, where I consider myself very much an introvert, and I'm kind of, in certain situations I can be very shy, other situations I can be quite outgoing. But I stumbled upon certain triggers that would put me into this zone. And my thing has always been making videos. I used to make like short films with my brother when we were kids, and always making videos. I was obsessed with videos my whole life. And what I found was that when I entered what I came to know eventually as a flow state, it felt to me basically I would describe it as just a poetic reverie, where I just like loosened up, and so it's like the loosening, the cognitive loosening, the mind loosening, basically shut down the part of the brain that was like second guessing. That was like, no, I don't dance at parties, no way. There's this stiff, holding back part was pushed aside, and something else emerged. And it doesn't matter what triggers flow. Sometimes flow can be triggered from the adrenaline of being on stage. Sometimes flow can be triggered from the excitement of something that just beckons. Sometimes flow can be triggered from breathing exercises. Jazz musicians and freestyle rappers love using cannabis. Like we're in California. Whatever floats your boat, truly, but as long as it gets you there. And what I didn't know that it was called flow at the time, but what I did realize is that there was something ecstatic about feeling in that state of mind, because it provided such a relief from the incessant chatter that clearly I have to deal with. And so there was a feeling of grace and gratitude when I found relief from my rumination and my existential despair. And so then I decided that has to be what I build my life around. And eventually, through research and a lot of reading, I came to learn all about flow and the neurobiology of flow and the advances that are happening in the psychology, technology, neurobiology, and pharmacology of ecstatic flow states. There's an acronym to describe flow called STIR. Selflessness, timelessness, effortlessness, and richness. So when you're in flow, Your sense of self vanishes. That's the inner critic. Your sense of time, how time is regulated in the brain, gets shut down. So time dilates, and the terror of the passing moment is no longer there. At least you're not aware of it. And finally, richness, information richness. You have access to more data because all the cul-de-sacs and error messages of the rumination are pushed aside. So that's all you have to remember. Stir. Selflessness, timelessness, effortlessness, and richness. And that's flow. And of course, whether it's a surfer, an athlete, a musician, people who build their lives around their flow report the highest levels of life satisfaction. So there's something to that, right? So it's like, if we start with the human condition and the existential bummer, and then we figure out, okay, how can we address this problem? Because, we're here, and we might as well do something with our lives. And so for me, it very quickly became, okay, these experiences of flow. And the art that came from the flow.
Yep.
Because on the other side, flow is, for me, every time I have flow, it's almost like a mystical experience. It's an experience of the divine, of the transcendent. I call it the aesthetic orgasm, Yeah. and then all the content that comes through is usually in response to an experience of such rapture that it demands a response. So if people are looking to be more creative in their life, I would say the question is not how to be more creative. The question is how to find so much ecstasy in whatever it is that gives you flow, and then in the afterglow, when you come down from that experience, you have so much creative output to share with the world that you won't know what to do with it. So there's a relationship between mood regulation and creativity, and so I say, flow has to do with mood regulation, has to do with like tapping into that ecstasy of the present moment, and then seeing what happens when you come out of that. Lots of creativity for me. So definitely flow, I would say, has been for me one of the antidotes to the human conundrum.
Yes. Flow being the antidote to the human conundrum, and then us being able to achieve it in whatever way we find.
Well, we're clever beings, right? And we can start figuring out what works.
What works for each of us individually.
What
works for our children that we birth into the world. We give them a lot of different options, and they figure themselves out.
For
what they
sure.
care about.
I mean, if our educational systems were built around what gives flow to our students, I'm sure that learning would accelerate tremendously.
What gives flow to our students?
Ken Robinson talks about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I went to a Montessori school for elementary school, and those schools tend to build a curriculum around the kids' predisposition and interests.
What do you think about unschooling?
Homeschooling?
Unschooling.
I don't know enough about it.
Unschooling away from the K through 12 system. A kid having just a computer when they're young, teach themselves language, teach themselves math or science or history or art or creativity, whatever they want to explore and teach themselves.
Without any guidance?
With maybe some sort of mentorship or guidance as well.
Sounds interesting, but what about the social part?
And then the social part as well is very important too. Some kids also don't have an interest as much in the social part, and they want to just make
fair enough. Yeah, I mean, if we had the resources to build a curriculum per kid, a unique educational profile per student, that would be awesome for sure. I support that. Aren't they doing something really interesting in Finland? Have you heard of this?
What is it?
In Finland, the educational system now, I read, is being built not around subjects but around problems to be solved, and problems become these projects, require knowledge in several different subjects to solve the problem. And so the students end up learning, about math or about science or about environmental studies, whatever, to solve the problem.
Multidisciplinary
project-based, but from elementary school.
That's great.
And they're not showing the highest levels of success in their educational system.
Yeah.
They're very sophisticated, which is great.
Very excited. Very exciting future of education, and also very exciting antidote that you're discovering about finding meaning and flow states, and also sharing that with other people. Oh, you needed water. I should have noticed. Okay, so in addressing this, you found flow states with yourself. You found sharing flow states and sharing how other people can get into flow states. I think a lot of us have an inner critic within us that is constantly combating with us. Don't do it. It's meaningless, etc. And I think a lot of us are finding that over time to be this path of flow and it feels great at times. It feels. How do you handle the times of, you don't have someone in your life right now that you love, right?
I'm not in a relationship, no.
You love your mother, and yeah, and but you're not in a relationship. So you know you've chosen to not be in a relationship right now. That love isn't the map right now for you, but the shots.
Oh
of
no,
Oz are.
I'm definitely a romantic, and I dive head first into it, knowing perfectly well it's going to smash my head or my heart at the end.
3 months, 3 years, one of those.
No. Look. So, existential bummer, and then flow is one of the antidotes. Romantic love is an indulgence that you have to have. You have to I treat at this point romantic love more like an aesthetic indulgence. In other words, like I like the idea of somebody saving me, but it doesn't matter how many times I'm disappointed in learning the same lesson that you can't rely on another person to be your everything. There's still something beautiful in the attempt. Like our tragic, don't you think? Like there's something like agonizingly beautiful about our efforts. Did you guys ever see Vanilla Sky, the film Vanilla Sky? I love that movie. A lot of people didn't like it. It was a misunderstood film. But the whole premise of that film, if you guys remember the ending, is that this character met this girl. Tom Cruise meets Penelope Cruz only once in the film. He really only met her like one night. And then the rest of the film, we find out at the end, was a virtual reality construct created for him after he kills himself, and he gets put into this nitrogen freezing thing. What do they call it? Cryogenics. And it's an advanced cryogenic facility that feeds you like a lucid dream while you sleep until technology advances to bring you back to life. And in his lucid dream, he constructed an entire storyline and a whole love affair where he ends up with this person, right? And the character tells him at the end when he's finding out what happened, he's like, you know, you barely knew her in your real life, but in your lucid dream, she was your savior. Right? You sculpted your lucid dream out of the iconography of your youth. You know, a movie you watched late at night that showed you what love could be like. You know, and that spoke to me so vividly because it just shows you how much like these formative experiences that we have as children, right, or even as teens, you know, music, album covers, movies, they create these archetypes in our minds, you know, archetypes of love, archetypes of transcendence, archetypes of achievement, and then we spend our entire lives trying to attain that fantasy and that wish fulfillment. And so even if it's even if we fail, I think it's the romantic part is in the attempt, you know.
Even what you just said right there, putting flow before love, is a very to find meaning. Is that in itself is a very controversial, I think, statement.
The problem is not loving somebody. The problem is the kind of love that you think will save you from mortality. You know, like that the love that will save you the way you hope that God will save you. Like the problem is the desire for salvation, but that's also the most kind of beautiful thing about us, I think. You know, like we will not go quietly into that good night. We will rage against the dying of the light. Even if we end up dying, we go kicking and screaming, you know. This refusal of an unwillingness to cede, you know, to give up, I think is kind of beautiful.
And they don't need to be contentious. You can find flow and then also find love and be super happy in life. Okay, how about... What is this? Okay, so what about the Buddhist perspective on things? The meditative perspective that I'm impermanent, totally cool, I'm just going to, you know, enjoy the time that I have, rather than the rage against it.
Work. No, look, I think the philosophy of non-attachment, and look, I'm not an expert on Buddhism. My limited understanding, though, has to do with not holding on to things. Yeah. And embracing a philosophy of non-attachment, because attachment is supposed to be bound to the ego, and if you transcend the ego and you don't have attachment, you suffer less. Yeah, and my intuition is you suffer less, but you also feel less, you love less, you desire less, you agonize beautifully less, you express yourself intensely less.
Interesting.
And so I think that the art that moves me is the art that arrests me, is the art that transforms me, is the art that pains me, is the art that gives me a gnawing feeling in my stomach. Like I like the push and pull, the ecstasy and the agony. I think it's what makes us us. I think it's romantic. Maybe I'm slightly masochistic, but I'm incompatible with the idea of non-attachment. You know, when I look at my family, people that I love, friendships that I love, places that I love, like I love those places and those people so much it hurts, right? The music that I love, sometimes I listen to a song and I love the song so much and I'll get sad from just the thought that I don't have eternity with which to listen to this song for. You know, like I watch a film like Inception and I'm just like, oh my God, I just wish that I could watch this film like once a week for the next million years, you know? Like I get off cognitively from art, from ideas, and from things that the whole notion of just letting that go is just incongruent to me. But to each his own, right?
Can there be a feeling of ecstasy with meditative feelings as well of not attaching to that feeling of ecstasy? But
you tell me.
I don't know either.
I made a video of every insight I've ever had because I didn't want to just let it go. If I would have just been non-attached to I would just like, you know, meditation sometimes tells us, you know, watch your thoughts, but don't be attached to them. Certainly some thoughts are not useful to attach yourself to, but every video that I made started with a thought. Every video started with a thought I did not let go of.
Yes.
It was a thought I became obsessed with. I wanted to make sense of it.
Yes,
I wanted to tile it with language.
Share it.
Know? And making the video was like a kind of psychological exorcism, and it was only through the act of making the video that I finally was at peace and could let it go. But see, now I haven't let it go. Now it's a thing that exists forever in tangible form. So it's my battle against ephemerality. All art is a battle against ephemerality. So I don't know. I mean, this non-attachment thing, I don't get it. I think it's a way to placate ourselves against the fear of death is what I think. Mm-hmm. It's a deathist rationalization that in the face of no other choice, you know, maybe the healthiest response is to find some noble acceptance. Like, oh, well, you know, it's God's will for this person to die a horrific death of cancer. It's God's will, you know, it's what God wanted. I don't buy it. I think it's a freaking tragedy. I think illness is a tragedy. I think death is a tragedy, you know, and
we also don't know what happens after death.
Well, hey, I'm sort of envious of people who are convinced of an afterlife. I'm envious for their peace while they're alive. But I just, you know, I can't convince myself. Doesn't mean that I can't be agnostic, but being agnostic doesn't rid me of, you know, the despair associated with infinite nothing.
Okay, so if you do get to live longer, and we have this era of transhumanism approaching us, what do you enjoy the moment, or do you have like every one out of every 5 of those moments you have to record and publish?
There's a guy called David Pierce. He wrote this whole online essay called The Hedonistic Imperative. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the hedonistic imperative, but he basically advocates for an engineering of a technological approach to engineering to radically extend human lifespan and eliminate diseases and eliminate suffering. He has this whole idea called paradise engineering, and the abolition of suffering. And he basically says it's like, let's do a collective human project like putting a man on the moon to eliminate human suffering from culture.
Yep.
But not just you know, the physical suffering of people, but like the suffering caused by disease, the suffering caused by aging, the suffering caused by mental illness. He himself says that the MDMA-like state of consciousness is a model for the perfect human state. The problem is that MDMA is in taking too much can be sort of toxic. Even though it's amazing for psychotherapy, it's not something you can do every day. But he envisions advances in biotechnology and psychopharmacology to eventually reprogram the mind, you know, at the level of neurons and neurotransmitters to engender a new baseline And the new baseline will be
pretty
something
intense.
more similar to an MDMA-like state, is what he says.
That's the new baseline.
Yeah, yeah. And well, there's some people that have there's a syndrome called Williams syndrome. They sometimes call it cocktail party syndrome, and it's actually very similar to the MDMA-like state. The problem is these people are so trusting and so loving with perfect strangers that they can be taken advantage of.
Yeah.
So everybody has to be on the same vibe in order for it not to be potentially dangerous for the person who has it. But the point is that there's a lot of different modalities of consciousness that are possible. So many altered states of consciousness mediated by different types of drugs hint at the different possibilities for phenomenology. This is just but one of millions. This is the one that has been selected for in this kind of Darwinian, competitive, survival-based, guarded, vigilant modality that we need right now to always plan for the future and prepare for the worst and so on and so forth. That's been selected for. But maybe that's not what we need in the future. Maybe in the future, AIs take care of everything, and human beings hang out and make art, and the kind of consciousness that is required is one that facilitates being in the present. Mm-hmm. Michael Pollan, in his new book, How to Change Your Mind, he talks about the psychotherapeutic benefits of psychedelics, in therapeutic settings to address the pathologies of anxiety and depression. And the book starts out with this idea that's fascinating. He says that the human brain, as it exists now, is like an artificial intelligence program. It takes in data from the present and compares it with data from the past and uses that to make predictions about the future. So we're like an artificial intelligence program making predictions. The brain is a prediction machine. And so what that creates is essentially a sense of impatience with lived life, a perpetual ADD, and living life in a kind of constant future tense. He says the funny line is, the good news is I'm seldom surprised, the bad news is I'm seldom surprised. Right? Because you're always predicting the future. You're always sort of a little bit vigilant, not quite present, because always on to the next thing. And so the good news is, nothing ever catches you off guard in a bad way. But equally bad is the news that nothing ever catches you off guard in a good way. You're never surprised. You're never delighted. You're always kind of jaded. The been there's and done that's of the adult mind. And so then he says, one of the things that commends travel, beauty, and certain kinds of drugs is precisely the fact that they block all signals forwards and backwards. So here you are tweaking the way the baseline works, and by blocking all signals forwards and backwards, backwards memory, right, and forwards is pre-modeling the future, you get rid of those signals and you're hurled instead into what he calls the astounding frontier of the present, a present that is literally wonderful. Wonder being precisely the byproduct of that unencumbered sense of first sight, the childlike wonder, the virginal noticing of the sensate world that is characterized with poetic rhapsody and inspiration and awe, and how awe has all these cognitive benefits. I mean, how nice would it be if we could reprogram ourselves so that our baseline was William Blake, right? To see the world in a grain of sand, and heaven in a wildflower, and hold infinity in the palm of our hands, and eternity in an hour. I mean, don't you want to live in that state? Don't you want to live inside of a poem? Don't you want to live inside of a pop song? It's possible, right? It's just we have to get our fucking shit together, right? We have to fix things. We have to get rid of inequality, economic inequality. We have to deal with people who are homeless and dying and suffering on the street. We have to address the grand challenges of humanity, which we could already do today if we just had the will. And then eventually, the technologies to do these things are advancing exponentially. Exponential, right? There are weeks, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. Exponential is weeks when decades happen. So the progress that we are already seeing is astounding, and directed towards the right things, we could address the grand challenges of humanity, and then we can turn our minds and ourselves into the ultimate engineering project, to tweak ourselves into blissful mind-body states where we could essentially be gods in a utopia beyond time. And that sounds to me like a project worth creating, going forth on, right? Like, that's, a boy can dream.
We get some of and this is good to ask in Q&A as well. We'll be right there in a couple minutes. So So stopping and smelling the roses, when you're on the beach, really loving the shells and the rocks. There's so many of these amazing examples. When you look at your mother, look at her like it was the first time that you looked at her, your partner. Just that state of not looking at the past, not looking at the future, being right there.
I mean, some of the greatest moments that a child has are precisely because he's unencumbered by responsibility. You know, like we also organize our society in a way that doesn't permit us to be very present, right? You got to hustle, and you got to be in an anxious state to get ahead. And we've inherited that from the anxious states of being ahead. When we lived in the savannas of Africa, we had to be one step ahead of the predators, and now we have to be one step ahead of our competitors. It's the same thing, but don't you? It's that even a blade of grass becomes a magnificent world in itself if given proper attention. Like if we were freed from the constraints burdening that limited faculty of our attention, maybe we could redirect it towards just the miracle of being alive, right? Yeah. Consciousness itself could be more indulgent upon its capacities to contemplate. I often I'm like a quote hoarder. Yeah. But the reason for that, my mother's a teacher, and she's taught for 40 years high school literature, and in her classroom walls, she always had beautiful quotes written like really big all over the walls, right? And granted, that's literature, but English class is really the class that teaches you how to be a human being, right? In math class, there's numbers on the walls. In chemistry class, there's chemistry equations on the walls. In English class, you have beautiful quotes that tell you how to be a better person on the wall. Minds are like parachutes. They only function when open. Practice random kindness and senseless acts of beauty. Like, these are the quotes that are on the wall. And so I think I kind of acquired that same impulse to surround myself by the ideas that point the way constantly, right? The wallpaper of my mind is filled with quotes that are like Post-it notes that remind me about the states of subjective well-being that I want to live inside of. Yeah. So wonder and awe are huge ones for me. And so I collect a lot of quotes about that. And obviously there's a lot of cognitive benefits of being in a state of awe and wonder. There's a line, there was an essay that I read once called The Death of Awe in the Age of Awesome. And Henry Wisemeyer wrote it. You guys should look up the piece. It's great. But he talks about how, or F. Scott Fitzgerald writing about wonder, he says that wonder is a transitory enchanted moment in which man must have held his breath, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. I mean, think about that. When was the last time you were face to face with something commensurate to your capacity for wonder? When was the last time that you completely eclipsed the been there's and done that's of the adult mind? That you were freed from the tedium of the daily and thrust into the numinous? Like, when was the last time you had a religious experience as a secular person? And what I mean by that was an experience that carried you outside yourself. An exhilarating neurostorm of such intellectual pleasure, of such cognitive ecstasy, that you basically had a mindgasm, right? An aesthetic orgasm. And that's healing. These experiences make us whole, and these experiences make us holy.
What was the Stanford study on benefits of awe?
So this is one of those examples of like science validating something we know intuitively. Stanford and Berkeley and other places did these studies on the subject of awe. And if you've seen my videos, you know that this is something I cite repeatedly. But basically, awe is an experience described as one of such perceptual vastness, right? Such perceptual expansion, that the mental models of the world that you usually rely upon to categorize things as happening to you, it's the been there's and done that's of the adult mind. It's like, oh yeah, that's a light. Oh yeah, that's a person. Oh yeah, I've seen those kinds of shirts before. Oh yeah, it's just another sunset, right? But occasionally you encounter something that's not in your maps as of now. Those maps you've built throughout your life to categorize and put things into order, you encounter something that doesn't fit into those maps. And it can be something that's genuinely outside those maps, or you can be in an altered state of consciousness that makes you see something that was already in the maps, but you're seeing it from a vastly different vantage point. Either or.
Yep.
But the point is that during those experiences, you have to now accommodate yourself, enter into a new relationship with this thing. And in that act, right, he calls it the dialectical pattern of reconcilable estrangement. This is David Lenson. Google it. But it's creating, the experience offers a distance between this thing and you, and then your new relationship with it closes that distance. And that act we experience subjectively as awe. This particular rhapsody, this awe-inspiring, paralyzing, opiated adjacency where you're cracked open and the light gets in, like Leonard Cohen says, right? Like these moments of awe, I mean, they're awesome, right? Duh. But they're not just pleasurable in that moment, but like I said before, they heal us, because after the fact, the studies found, people report increased feelings of well-being, increased feelings of compassion, increased feelings of creativity, those three. Oh, and the experience acts as an anti-inflammatory. So it has all these markers in your body that essentially it's good for you.
So awe will bring us closer together as civilization.
Well, awe is everything, bro. Like the people these studies about awe were in Berkeley and Stanford, but then the studies that are coming out now, treating people with PTSD, anxiety, and depression with psychedelics, the stuff from Johns Hopkins University and the Imperial College of London that Michael Pollan wrote about in his new book. These studies say that the healing takes place only when people experience a mystical experience while under these molecules. And if you look at the hallmarks, if you fill the questionnaire, the William James questionnaire of a mystical experience, all of the attributes mimic or mirror the experience of awe that I was just talking about before. A feeling of the sacred, a feeling of communion with the cosmos, a feelings of infinite connection with other human beings, a feeling of well-being, a feeling of noetic truth, of ultimate reality being revealed, right? So mystical experiences mediated by psychedelics, treating people who are sick from depression and anxiety with treatment resistance, right? The more mystical the experience, the more they report the healing weeks and months afterwards. Same with people who experience awe. That doesn't necessarily have to be mediated by psychedelics. It can be the birth of a child. It can be seeing the Grand Canyon for the first time. It can be making love to somebody new. It can be traveling.
Yep.
But the whole point is that we need to pay more attention to what happens to us that is so healing during these moments that are so, economically non-useful.
Yeah.
Right? Because... Right?
You get obsessed with that flower. It's not bringing you $1,000.
No.
Yeah.
That's what's so interesting. So it's like we're so obsessed with productivity now, and we encourage the use of substances that promote productivity, like caffeine and Ritalin and but I think we're going to have to start paying more attention to these other domains of mind, the ecstatic domains. And I'm not the only person saying this by any means. I mean, this is what Michael Pollan talked about in his book. This is what the book Stealing Fire that Jamie Wheel and Stephen Kotler wrote that was also a bestseller. We need to pay more attention to the ecstatic. And increasingly, as we give up our jobs to automation in the future, which is happening, we're going to have to find more creative and hopefully more joyous ways to fill our time.
Is it better to find the ecstatic in things that are not necessarily mundane? So rather than finding ecstatic moments in the mundane, can we craft things that are not yet discovered by humans and that be our ecstasy? Is there one that's better than the other?
I mean, for me, the ultimate one would be something like the end of the movie Contact.
Yeah.
Like, if we were able to make a portal to the other end of the galaxy and witness celestial events outside of space and time and talk to aliens, that would be pretty awe-inspiring. One of my favorite lines about that movie is precisely when she says they should have sent a poet. They should have sent a poet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Carl Sagan, man.
Yeah.
But yeah, man, I mean, that's what we need to start doing that. Like, journeys without and journeys within, right? Let's go explore the solar system, and let's create virtual reality engines in combination with new entheogenic molecules and explore the inner solar system too.
Yeah, there it is.
I'm more interested in what's next in terms of that. Like, what's the next
baseline?
What's the next baseline? Also, what's the next level of like immersive art? Like, what happens when immersive theater meets VR, meets like maybe certain molecules that make you more suggestible and facilitate the suspension of disbelief, you know, and that because, you know, the sky's the limit. I think in terms of the future of art, you know.
So within this art, 500 years ago, we saw Michelangelo take years to sculpt the Statue of David, years to make the Sistine Chapel. 500 years later, we are so heavily addicted to instant gratification. Are we gonna? How do you see us transcending that?
You're talking about the consequences of increasingly limited attention spans because we're always getting hit with like the next dopamine hit on the top of our social media feed.
We used to spend years making one piece of art, and what?
Well, he did.
Well, a lot of people did. There are tapestries, paintings, sculptures, film.
Sure.
These things used to take years.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the consequence that now everybody can participate in the global conversation, whether it's by writing or publishing or making art, means everybody has access, but it also means there's more noise and more mediocrity.
Yes.
Not everybody's a Michelangelo. So that's like the trade-off, right? Everybody has a voice, but a lot of like non-interesting voices crowd your feed so that you barely ever see anything magnificent anymore. But everybody has a voice.
That's the high noise.
So maybe I don't know. Maybe that's maybe the role of curation, and maybe there needs to be a new focus on excellence.
Yes,
you know,
and that can be how we transcend it.
Yeah,
the short-term addictions that we have. Okay, as you were talking about the cosmic perspective, we do like to ask a couple questions on the show. Do you think we are alone in the cosmos?
Have you guys heard of the transcension hypothesis? No? Okay.
Explain for us.
So it's a good theory to account for Fermi's paradox. Fermi's paradox is the one that says that given the size of the universe, of even the observable universe, and given the preconditions that potentially are there for life, how come we see no evidence of intelligent life, right? We found all these Earth-like planets, all these things in the habitable zone, and then you just infer the rest using some mathematical equations about scale, and you're like, wow, there should be plenty of advanced civilizations, and yet we see no evidence of it. That's Fermi's paradox, right? There should be, but there isn't. And so the transcension hypothesis is an answer to that paradox. And basically it says the following. If you look at our own evolution and our technological advancement, it goes in two directions. It goes outward as we spread across the planet and make massive cities and make airplanes and then make rockets and go to the moon. Like there's this outward expansion of our technological scaffolding, right? Like a spider's web, like spreading out potentially into the universe. Yet simultaneously, there's this inward expansion as we make denser and denser computational substrates, right? The chips keep getting more powerful, the processing capacity gets more powerful and infinitely smaller until you eventually might get to what he calls femtoscale computing, which is computing that's like computational density that's on the size of like black hole-like dimensions of computational density, okay? And the idea being is, so we have this outward expansion, but then we have this much faster exponential inward expansion. And no doubt, eventually, maybe a couple hundred years, whatever, we're going to live in virtual realities because that's just what's going to happen. Synthetic artificial intelligences that can think and essentially have personhood will live inside of these virtual realms, inside of femtoscale density computational substrates. So we're going to basically open up a virtual universe that's operating in dimensions that are smaller than and more dense than a black hole. So we will disappear out of space and time, out of the visible universe through these femtoscale dimensions. And so transcension is basically that. We disappear into an outside of space and time, and that's when we find all the other advanced civilizations. So they went in instead of out. That's transcension. That's a real thing coined by a guy called John Smart. You can Google it. And I made a video about it. So I think that's probably the best plausible account for why we haven't found the aliens. I certainly don't believe any of the reports of flying saucers or anything like that. Those sound more like psychedelic delusions.
That's a really good one, though. Transcension hypothesis?
Yeah.
That's a really interesting one.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Okay, and then do you think we're already in a simulation?
I'm going to read a passage to answer that. Only because I don't have what I think is a good answer on the simulation hypothesis, like whether we're in a simulation right now. Like, I think it can be argued either way. But one of the things that
you just argued for transcension hypothesis.
But listen to this. So Kevin Kelly talks about, he started Wired magazine, and he talks about a series of discontinuities that have changed how we see ourselves in the cosmos. The first one was when we thought we were the center of the universe, and then we realized we're just a little speck of dust in the sunbeam. and then another discontinuity has been the one that we think that we're like somehow special and the other animals are not, like we're gods and they're not. And then we realized evolution, no, we're the same, we're on a continuity. So the discontinuity was eliminated again. The third one that we're going through now is that we think ourselves as different from the man-made or the human-made. So there's the natural, the organic, and the human-made is somehow unnatural. But increasingly we realize that we're just smack in the middle between the born and the made, and that's another continuum. And the technium, which is the Kevin Kelly phrase for the organism that we call technology, he calls the seventh kingdom of life. So technology is, we realize, is just continuous with biological evolution. But then the last exceptionalism, and it goes into this idea of whether we're in a simulation or not, the fifth discontinuity is the special status that we give to the physical. We feel the universe to be a place full of physical material that pushes back and presses against us. Things have weight, size, and duration. That's what the universe is in everyday experience, the real stuff that can be measured, felt, and sensed. Our world of matter and energy follows a set of laws to such an exacting degree that we can manipulate it to make rockets and computers. That's pretty solid. Matter's consistent refusal to be bullied outside of its own laws adds to the sense of it being real, right? Real means physical, right? Information, on the other hand, lacks physicality. Unlike energy, which we can at least measure with physical instruments, a digital bit is disembodied. It weighs nothing. It takes up no space. We don't have good measures for information. We are not yet sure if the total amount of information in the universe is conserved, nor if it is finite. Yet we have come to see that life, even our own life, is a pattern of intangible information rather than material form. Evolution, that great engine of creation, is a pattern of information. And mind, especially the mind, is a type of information flow. So we know that the most powerful forces in the universe that we are aware of are constructed of the most intangible things we can detect, bits. There stands the discontinuity, atoms versus bits. But lately, physicists have begun to suspect that atoms themselves are composed of information in some way that we don't understand. As the legendary physicist John Wheeler puts it, its are bits. The deeper we inspect the interior of subatomic particles and their quirky behavior, the more they can be explained as information flows. Many physicists expect that when we get to the bottom of how matter works, we'll find primarily a structure of information and the absence of anything material. Atoms will be understood as elaborate, dynamic arrangements of intangible signals. Solid-state physicist David Mermin writes, matter acts, but there are no actors behind the actions. The verbs are verbing all by themselves, without a need to introduce nouns. Actions act upon other actions. There's no duality between the existence of a thing and its properties. Properties are all there is. Indeed, there are no things. As this discontinuity between the realm of the physical and the realm of the immaterial is erased, scientists have begun to re-envision the laws of physics as complex algorithms of code. Energy also is being restated in terms of information. The pulsating stars and iron planets will gradually be seen by science as wisps of intangible nothings. Organisms and technologies, including mega structures like skyscrapers and starships and floating cities, will be defined as structures of computation, equivalent to software. So if that's the case, then yeah.
Yeah, I'm really happy that you read that. Jason, last question, and we'll open up for Q&A. Last question is, what do you think is the most beautiful thing in the world?
Whew. So I recently I underwent an experience of psycholytic therapy, which is with a nurse who has a degree in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy to take care of me, to address some related issues that I had with anxiety, as you know I deal with. And one of the things that came to mind during that time was that the most, not just when something is beautiful, but the sensation that it occasions, right? The feeling of beholding beauty, right, is the most exquisite and important thing in the world. And by the way, that's a big umbrella term. You can include love under beauty. You can include aesthetic experiences under beauty. But I just think that, to me, the most beautiful thing in the world is the cognitive and aesthetic orgasm, which is the moment in which you commune with something magnificent beyond yourself. So it's a moment of revealed truth and ecstasy and merger and communion. And it's when you cry, not from sadness, but from ecstasy, right?
Yeah.
Why does beauty make us cry? Asked Alain de Botton. And he says it's because what it hints at is the exception. And so there's this cognitive dissonance between what you're seeing and what you know the average to be. And in order to correct that imbalance, you cry. It fixes the discontinuity there. And that's called catharsis. Yeah. I love catharsis.
Yeah.
But you can have an experience like watching a film, and a film builds up slowly and magnificently, or a melody might do, and it works to. Have you heard Jordan Peterson talk about music and how it speaks meaning to people? It's the one thing that cynical people can't be cynical about, and I feel the same way about good films. They speak meaning, they broadcast meaning. And meaning is like oxygen for us, right? You guys know that line that says, a human being can live for, a week without food, or 3 or 4 days without water, but you can't live for a minute without hope, right? That's why people commit suicide, when they lose hope. Meaning is the antidote to hopelessness. Meaning and signification, is everything. And so the capacity of music and cinema to the way it delivers meaning to us, the way it patterns it, like melodically, and then like spoon feeds it to us, is almost tantric in a cognitive way. It's to me it's everything. And to regularly submit, talk about surrender, the ecstatic surrender to a work of art, to a work of meaning, I think is the greatest possible indulgence that we can give ourselves amidst the cosmic tragedy of being finite beings who dream of immortality. So that's like the temporary fix until the singularity makes us all immortal and saves us. So, yeah.
What a wonderful conversation, Jason. Just super blessed to have had you in San Francisco. I've been here. We all greatly appreciate you and love your work so much. And we hope to see you again very soon.
Thanks, bro.
Thank you.
We'll take some questions.
Q&A now.